I still remember the sound of laughter more clearly than her words. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, blending together into a cruel echo that wrapped around me and refused to let go. I had walked into that place believing I belonged there, believing that at least one person in that crowd was on my side. I was wrong. She stood there, confident, flawless, glowing with the attention she craved. And when she looked at me, there was no warmth left in her eyes. Only impatience. Only contempt. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't pull me aside. She chose the center of the room, where everyone could see, where everyone could hear. Her words came out sharp and clear, each one cutting deeper than the last. She called me a burden. She said I was embarrassing her. She laughed and asked why I ever thought I deserved someone like her. Every sentence landed like a slap, and with every laugh from the crowd, I felt something inside me crack. I wanted to speak. I wanted to explain. I wanted to defend myself. But my throat locked, and my body refused to move. I could feel people staring, some curious, some amused, some recording on their phones like my humiliation was entertainment. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a moment, a joke, something to be shared later with captions and emojis. She pointed at my clothes, at my job, at my life. She compared me to others, men who had more money, more status, more confidence. Men who, in her words, were actually worth something. And when she said that, she smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an awkward one. It was a satisfied smile, like she had finally said what she'd been waiting to say for a long time. I realized then that this wasn't sudden. This wasn't an accident. She had planned this moment. She wanted witnesses. She wanted an audience. She wanted to make sure that when she walked away from me, I would be too ashamed to follow. The worst part wasn't even what she said. It was how easily she said it. As if every memory we shared meant nothing. As if every sacrifice I made for her was invisible. I remembered the nights I stayed awake listening to her fears, the times I chose her needs over my own, the moments I believed love was enough to make everything work. Standing there, exposed and silent, I understood that to her, I was already erased. When she finally finished, there was a pause. Just a second, long enough for hope to flicker foolishly in my chest. Long enough for me to think maybe she would stop, maybe she would realize she'd gone too far. But then she shook her head, laughed again, and said the words that ended everything. "I'm done pretending," she said. "I deserve better than you." And just like that, she turned her back on me. The room exploded into noise. Conversations restarted. People moved on as if nothing important had happened. As if a human being hadn't just been torn apart in front of them. I stood there alone, my hands shaking, my mind blank. I could feel heat on my face, not from anger, but from shame. A deep, suffocating shame that made me want to disappear. I walked out without saying a word. I don't even remember how I reached home. The streets blurred together, and the world felt distant, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. When I closed the door behind me, the silence was unbearable. No laughter, no voices, just the echo of her words repeating in my head over and over again. That night, I didn't cry right away. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, replaying every second, wondering what I could have done differently, wondering when I stopped being enough, wondering how someone who once held my hand could enjoy crushing me so publicly. Messages started coming in. Some people asking what happened. Some pretending to care. Most just curious. I didn't reply to any of them. I turned off my phone and let the darkness swallow me. Because explaining humiliation only makes it feel worse. What broke me most was the realization that she would sleep peacefully that night. That she would feel relieved. Proud, even. While I lay there questioning my worth, my existence, my future. She had taken something from me in that moment. Something I didn't know how to get back. Trust, dignity, the belief that being good was enough. By morning, the story had already spread. Clips, screenshots, comments, strangers judging me based on seconds of my worst moment. I became that guy. The one who got publicly destroyed. The one who didn't even fight back. People love to analyze pain when it doesn't belong to them. I avoided mirrors because I couldn't recognize the person staring back. He looked smaller, weaker, like the world had shrunk him with a few cruel sentences. I asked myself if she was right. If I really was nothing. If I really deserved to be thrown away like that. But deep down, beneath the humiliation and the shock, something else was forming. Not anger, not revenge. Something quieter, heavier. A realization that this moment, as painful as it was, had revealed the truth. Not about me, but about her. She didn't humiliate me because I was worthless. She humiliated me because she needed to feel powerful. And at that time, I didn't know it yet, but that public humiliation was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. After that day, I vanished from everyone's life without announcing it. There was no dramatic goodbye, no explanation post, no attempt to clear my name. I simply stopped showing up. To the people who watched me get humiliated, it probably looked like I had accepted defeat, like I had crawled away to hide. In truth, I didn't disappear because I was weak. I disappeared because I couldn't survive being seen like that anymore. The first few weeks were the hardest. Every morning I woke up with her voice still echoing in my head. Her laughter replayed itself before I even opened my eyes. I avoided crowded places because I was terrified of running into someone who had seen that moment, someone who would look at me with pity, worse, recognition. Even silence felt loud. It reminded me of how alone I had become overnight. I lost more than a relationship that day. I lost my sense of identity. I had built my life around being dependable, understanding, patient. I believed that if I gave enough, loved enough, endured enough, I would be valued. When she shattered me so publicly, it forced me to confront a painful truth. I had been living to be chosen, not living to be whole. Money became a problem quickly. Opportunities that once felt stable disappeared because I no longer had the confidence to chase them. Interviews felt like interrogations. Rejections felt personal. I took whatever work I could find, jobs no one else wanted, hours no one else could tolerate. I worked late into the night and early into the morning, not because I was ambitious, but because exhaustion was the only thing that silenced my thoughts. There were nights I came home so tired that I collapsed without eating. Nights when I stared at the ceiling, wondering how my life had been reduced to survival. I would think about her, not with longing, but with disbelief. How easily she had walked away. How clean her exit had been. It felt unfair that she could move on while I was still collecting the pieces of myself from the floor. People stopped reaching out after a while. Silence replaced curiosity. In that silence, something shifted. Without an audience, without expectations, I was forced to sit with myself. No labels, no roles, just the raw version of who I was when no one was watching. It was uncomfortable, painful, but honest. I started reading, not motivational quotes, not success stories, but books that challenged how I saw the world. I learned about self-respect, about boundaries, about the difference between love and self-erasure. For the first time, I questioned why I had tolerated disrespect for so long, why I believed patience meant accepting humiliation, why I thought being kind required being small. Progress was slow. Some days I felt strong. Other days, I felt like I was back at zero. But I kept going because stopping meant facing the past again, and I wasn't ready for that. I began setting small goals, saving a little money, learning a new skill, improving quietly. No announcements. No validation, just growth that belonged only to me. There were moments when anger tried to take over. I imagined confronting her, imagined proving her wrong in dramatic ways. But every time those thoughts surfaced, they left me feeling emptier. I realized revenge would keep me tied to her, and I was desperate to be free. So I let the anger pass, even when it hurt to do so. Over time, my reflection started to change. Not physically at first, but internally. I stood straighter. I spoke less, but with more certainty. I stopped apologizing for existing. I learned that silence could be strength, and distance could be protection. The world hadn't become kinder, but I had become harder to break. The humiliation that once defined me began to lose its grip. It became a memory, not a wound. A lesson, not a label. I understood now that what happened to me was not a verdict on my worth, but a revelation of someone else's character. That understanding didn't erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. There was a quiet pride in knowing that while she believed she had ended me, I was rebuilding myself beyond her reach. She had thrown me away publicly, assuming I would never recover. She never imagined that the man she humiliated would one day stand without bitterness, without fear, without needing her approval. I wasn't chasing success to impress anyone. I wasn't improving to be seen. I was doing it because I refused to remain the version of myself that accepted humiliation as love. Every step forward was a promise I made to myself, a promise that no one would ever have the power to reduce me like that again. By the time the world forgot my humiliation, I had already outgrown it. And though I didn't know it then, the silence I disappeared into was shaping me for a moment when my past would return, not to hurt me, but to face the man it helped create. Years later, I didn't expect her name to reappear in my life. After everything, I had convinced myself that she was just another memory, a painful one, yes, but one I had carefully tucked away. I had rebuilt slowly, brick by brick, in quiet anonymity. My success was silent, unnoticed by the people who had laughed at me. I was content in my solitude, believing that the past belonged behind me, sealed away in a chapter one had no intention of reopening. But life is a way of surprising us, of forcing the past into the present when we least expect it. And for her, it came not from me, but from someone whose voice carried far more weight than Hayes ever did, her grandmother. Her grandmother was a woman of sharp eyes and sharper words. Even in her old age, she commanded attention with every step she took, every gesture she made. People listened when she spoke, not because she demanded it, but because they knew her judgment was final, and her consequences inevitable. She was the matriarch, the keeper of family honor, and the one whose opinions could not be ignored. It was through her that I learned she had discovered the humiliation I had endured. She didn't call me to console me. She didn't call to apologize. She called her granddaughter. I can only imagine how it must have sounded on the other end of the line. Her grandmother's voice, firm and unwavering, dissecting her granddaughter's pride, exposing the cruelty she had committed years ago. The words were deliberate, heavy, and unrelenting. Disappointment dripped from each syllable. She reminded her of every misstep, every laugh that had been cruel, every wound inflicted that had gone unchecked. She spoke of responsibility, of respect, of accountability. And then came the ultimatum, the words that would turn her confidence into fear, her laughter into silence. You will marry the man you threw away, or you will face the consequences of abandoning your family forever. There was no room for negotiation, no room for excuses. The power she held was absolute, and for the first time, my humiliation was being mirrored back onto her, not as mockery, but as a reckoning. I was not there to witness the call, but I felt the shift immediately. Her posture, once upright with arrogance, faltered. Her voice, which had so easily commanded attention before, trembled under the weight of obligation. Her grandmother's words had exposed the fragility beneath her bravado, a fragility she had never allowed me to see before. And as I later saw her, summoned to my presence, it was clear she understood, for the first time in her life, that her actions had consequences she could not escape. The first moment we met again was surreal. She walked in, a picture of hesitation and regret, carrying the remnants of a pride like a heavy cloak that no longer fit. Her eyes darted to mine, searching for the weak, broken man she had left behind, expecting to see someone diminished, someone eager for her forgiveness. She was not prepared for the calm that met her gaze. I had not returned to punish her, to yell, to seek revenge. I had returned as someone who had mastered silence, who had found strength in absence, who had learned that the loudest power is restraint. Her grandmother's words had orchestrated this meeting, but it was I who now held the stage. The humiliation she had inflicted was no longer mine to carry. It had transformed into a lesson she could not escape. She spoke, attempting apologies, fumbling with explanations, trying to explain away her past behavior. But I listened, knowing that no excuse could rewrite what had happened. The room felt heavy. Each word she uttered weighed down by the truth she had tried so hard to ignore. Her fear was subtle but undeniable. For the first time, she realized that control was not hers. She had spent years believing that her actions were consequence-free, that charisma and manipulation could shield her from accountability. Standing before me, she confronted a reality she had never considered, that life has a way of balancing the scales, quietly, relentlessly, and that the man she had dismissed, the man she had laughed at in public, had grown stronger while she had remained the same. There was a strange satisfaction in watching the arrogance crumble, in seeing her adjust to a world in which her choices mattered in ways she hadn't anticipated. But I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. Power, I had learned, is quiet. Dignity does not need applause. She realized, in those moments, that her grandmother's decision was not a punishment orchestrated by malice. It was a demand for accountability, a call to confront her own failings. And she was unprepared for the weight of that truth. The months that followed were tense. Meetings, conversations, and family gatherings became a study in contrasts. Her grandmother's influence loomed over every interaction, reminding her that compliance was not optional. And while she struggled with her pride, I moved through each encounter with measured patience. I did not seek to humiliate her further. I did not need to. She was already learning the lessons she had once refused to acknowledge. Even as she tried to regain control, even as she attempted to reassert her authority over a situation she had once dominated, the imbalance was clear. The power had shifted, and she understood it. She had underestimated life, underestimated the consequences of her own cruelty, and underestimated the resilience of the person she had dismissed. It was a quiet revelation, one that did not need witnesses, one that did not need announcements. It was enough that she knew. Her grandmother's intervention had been the catalyst, but the real transformation was internal. She now faced the reality that her actions mattered, that her choices carried weight, and that the man she had once humiliated was no longer at her mercy. And though she tried to mask it, her fear was evident in the small things. A pause too long before speaking, a glance that lingered on me with unspoken questions, a hesitation that revealed the fracture beneath her composed exterior. And in those moments, I realized that the humiliation she had inflicted years ago had not been permanent, but temporary. Life had a way of correcting itself, quietly and with precision. She had laughed when she thought she had all the power, and now she was learning the weight of accountability. And I, the man she had discarded, had become the embodiment of that lesson, not through cruelty, but through survival, resilience, and quiet strength. No one else needed to witness her reckoning. No one else needed to approve of my success or my composure. The world had judged me once, and it had moved on. But she could not move on, not without confronting the consequences of her own actions. And that, I realized, was enough. The scales had been balanced. The humiliation had been repaid, not through vengeance, but through life itself, through the slow, inevitable return of justice. Her grandmother's words, her command, her insistence on marriage, had forced her to see what she had refused to see on her own. And in that, there was a strange beauty, not in the suffering, but in the awakening. The arrogance that had defined her, that had allowed her to dismiss me so easily, was giving way to understanding, to humility, to the awareness that choices matter and that consequences are unavoidable. And as I watched her adjust to this new reality, as I saw her struggle with the pride she had once wielded like a weapon, I understood that life had delivered a lesson far more powerful than any confrontation I could have orchestrated. The man she had humiliated was no longer broken. The woman who had laughed at him was finally facing the weight of her own actions, guided by the hand of someone whose authority she could not ignore. It was a strange moment of closure. Not mine, not yet, but hers. She had been forced to confront the truth, and I had been forced to witness it. And in that witness, I found a calm satisfaction, a quiet understanding that life, in its own way, ensures balance. That the pain she had caused, the humiliation she had inflicted, was not lost. It had transformed, shifted, and returned, not as vengeance, but as clarity. And in that clarity, I realized something important. The past does not need to haunt us forever. It teaches us. It shapes us. It prepares us for moments when the world itself, or the people who wronged us, finally catches up. Her grandmother had set the stage. Life had directed the performance. And I, the man she had once discarded, had emerged not as a victim, but as the quiet force of inevitability. I did not need to speak. I did not need to assert myself. The lesson had been delivered. The humiliation she once inflicted was now a mirror reflecting her own choices back at her. And in that mirror, she finally saw the cost of cruelty, the weight of pride, and the consequences of a moment she had thought insignificant. The balance had been restored, quietly, precisely, and completely. The first time she stood in front of me after all those years, I could see the weight of her own choices pressing down on her. She was no longer the confident, untouchable woman who had laughed at me in front of everyone. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, her movements were tentative, and for the first time, I noticed the tension in her posture. She searched my face, clearly expecting to find the broken man she had discarded, the one she had humiliated without consequence. What she didn't realize was that I had grown in silence, that the humiliation she had caused had forged something stronger within me, something she could no longer recognize, let alone control. She tried to speak first, but the words caught in her throat. She had rehearsed apologies in her head, imagined dramatic explanations, but none of them seemed to fit the gravity of the moment. I could hear her inhale sharply, trying to summon the old confidence that had once allowed her to dismiss me so easily. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Silence is a language all its own. It carries weight. It commands attention. And in that silence, I could feel the shift. She was no longer leading the encounter. I was. Her voice finally broke through, trembling slightly as she addressed me. She attempted to apologize, her words hesitant and clumsy, betraying the nervousness she had never shown in public before. I didn't mean, she started, only to pause and start again. Each phrase seemed to struggle under the weight of the truth, the realization that the man she had humiliated had survived, had endured, and had emerged stronger. Every word she tried to use to explain herself fell flat, and I listened quietly, letting her stumble, letting her confront the reality she had avoided for so long. I noticed her glances, darting nervously around the room as if seeking escape. But there was no escape this time. No crowd to mask her shame, no friends to laugh with her at my expense. She was alone with the consequences of her actions, and I was the embodiment of those consequences. I did not mock her, did not gloat, and did not let my eyes betray any satisfaction. There was no need. Life had already done the work. Her grandmother's insistence, her family's expectations, and the years of her own choices had delivered a lesson far more powerful than anything I could have orchestrated. She tried to regain control, attempted to assert her old dominance with subtle shifts in tone and posture. But I had learned to observe. I had learned to read the unspoken. And in her every attempt to mask fear and hesitation, I saw the cracks. The arrogance that had once defined her was fading, replaced by a vulnerability she had never allowed herself to feel. The woman who had once humiliated me was now confronting a truth she had long ignored. Power is not given, it is aimed, and it can be taken away just as easily. Her apologies continued, faltering, as she searched for words that could undo the past. She spoke of regret, of mistakes, of lessons she had learned too late. But I remained silent, listening, understanding that the lesson was not mine to deliver. It was hers to internalize. I had learned long ago that revenge is empty, satisfaction is fleeting. True power comes from endurance, from resilience, from the ability to survive and grow stronger when others try to tear you down. And she was finally learning that firsthand. There was a moment when our eyes locked, and for the first time, she truly saw me. Not as the man she had discarded, not as the object of ridicule, not as a failure, but as someone who had endured, who had persevered, who had transformed humiliation into strength. It was a quiet recognition, subtle yet profound, that spoke volumes without words. Her expression shifted from defiance to realization, from confidence to fear, as she understood that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The days that followed were a study in tension. Every interaction, every conversation, carried an undercurrent of awareness. She moved carefully, aware of the weight of her past actions and the strength I now embodied. I moved with measured patience, allowing her to confront her own insecurities without interference. I did not need to assert dominance, because it was already evident in the way she responded, in the hesitation that colored her tone, in the subtle adjustment she made to accommodate a reality she had once dismissed. Even her friends and family began to notice the change. The once confident woman who had commanded attention now treaded lightly, aware that her past arrogance had been replaced by a quiet authority she could no longer challenge. I observed without interference, understanding that the lesson was unfolding naturally. Humiliation, when confronted with resilience and dignity, has a way of teaching more effectively than any confrontation, any argument, any forceful demonstration of power. She attempted to engage in conversation, seeking connection, perhaps reconciliation, perhaps redemption. But I responded with composure, measured words, and careful restraint. I did not seek to humiliate her further. I did not seek to punish. Her fear, her realization, and her awareness of the consequences were punishment enough. The balance had shifted, and she understood it. Every attempt she made to regain control was met with calm observation, reinforcing the new dynamic that had taken root. There were moments when her eyes betrayed lingering regret, fleeting glimpses of the arrogance she had once carried now tempered by understanding. She was learning that life does not easily forgive those who seek to diminish others. The man she had once mocked had endured, had grown stronger, and had learned the power of patience, silence, and resilience. And she, who had once wielded humiliation as a weapon, was now grappling with the weight of accountability she had never anticipated. I watched as she struggled to reconcile her past behavior with the reality before her. The woman who had humiliated me was confronting the truth she had refused to acknowledge. The consequences of cruelty are inevitable, and the strength of those who endure cannot be underestimated. I had emerged not as a victim, but as a quiet force of inevitability, a living testament to the fact that resilience, dignity, and patience outweigh arrogance, cruelty, and temporary victories. Every interaction reinforced the lesson she could not ignore. Her grandmother's influence had initiated the reckoning, but the real shift was internal. She was learning, slowly and painfully, that choices have consequences, that pride unchecked by responsibility leads to downfall, and that the man she had discarded was no longer at her mercy. The power she had once assumed was hers to wield had quietly shifted, and she was forced to navigate a reality she had never considered. I did not need to speak to assert this truth. My presence, my calm composure, and my quiet strength were enough. The humiliation she had once inflicted had been transformed into a lesson she could no longer avoid. And in witnessing this, I understood something profound. The past does not need to dominate the present. It teaches, shapes, and prepares us for moments when life itself enforces balance, when those who once wronged us are faced with the consequences they have long ignored. As she moved through these moments, awkward, hesitant, and constrained by her own recognition of what she had done, I remained steady. I had learned that real power is silent, that real strength is measured not in confrontation, but in endurance. The woman who had once broken me was now confronting a reality she could not escape, and I was free from the need to intervene further. Life had delivered the lesson with precision, guided by the hands of authority, circumstance, and inevitability. And in her quiet struggle, I saw the final truth. Humiliation inflicted on others is never permanent when resilience is cultivated. The man she had discarded had survived, had grown, and had returned stronger than ever. And the woman who had once commanded power with arrogance was learning, slowly and painfully, that the consequences of her choices are unavoidable. Life, in its quiet and relentless way, had balanced the scales, and I had emerged as the embodiment of that balance. The announcement of the marriage came quietly, without fanfare, but it carried a weight that could not be ignored. She had spent years believing that the world was Hayes to command, that consequences were something that happened to others, never to her. But now, she faced a reality she had long resisted. The man she had humiliated, the man she had dismissed publicly, was now the pivot around which her life would revolve. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no theatrics. The shift had already occurred silently, inexorably, and the world watched as her arrogance collided with inevitability. She approached the situation with caution, every movement calculated, every word measured. Pride, once her shield, had become a weight she could barely bear. She no longer laughed freely or spoke with the same confidence she had wielded as a weapon. Even her closest allies could see it. The woman who had once commanded attention now navigated the world with hesitation, aware that her choices had consequences she could no longer evade. And I watched, silent, composed, letting her confront the truth in her own time, in her own way. The first encounter on the day of the announcement was brief, yet charged with unspoken tension. She stood before me, her eyes wide, searching for some sign of weakness she could exploit. She found none. She had expected confrontation, perhaps anger, perhaps vindictive pleasure. But what she met instead was calm, composure, dignity, a presence that spoke louder than words, a quiet assertion of strength that left no room for her old manipulations. She faltered under the weight of what she had done, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear reflected in her eyes. Family members whispered, onlookers speculated, and yet the air around us remained controlled, measured, deliberate. I did not need to speak to assert dominance. The years of struggle, the silent rebuilding, the resilience forged in private, had already spoken for me. And as she faced the consequences of her actions, it became clear that life itself had delivered a lesson she could not escape. Every choice she had made, every humiliation she had inflicted, was now mirrored back upon her, and she had no escape from the truth. The marriage was not a celebration for her. It was a reckoning. The dynamics had shifted completely. She who had once believed she held all the power now found herself constrained, accountable, and aware of the cost of her past behavior. She moved cautiously, aware of the eyes upon her, aware that the man she had once humiliated now embodied authority, patience, and control. Every word she spoke was tempered by recognition, every gesture measured against the reality she had once ignored. Even her closest confidants noticed the change. The woman who had once been so assured now spoke softly, carefully, aware that the world was watching how she navigated this new power dynamic. There was no open humiliation this time, no ridicule, no spectacle. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement, a subtle recognition that the tables had turned, and the man she had discarded, who had once been the subject of public mockery, now moved with an ease born of survival, resilience, and self-reclamation. As the days progressed, the lessons deepened. She struggled with the knowledge that her pride had led her astray, that her arrogance had blinded her to the consequences of cruelty. Her grandmother's guidance had set the stage, but it was life's quiet insistence that delivered the full impact. She had once believed that laughing at others' suffering was harmless, that humiliation was a tool she could wield without consequence. Now she understood, painfully and intimately, that the consequences are inevitable and inescapable. Through it all, I observed without interference. I did not seek vengeance. I did not seek to assert my superiority. The power of what had transpired lay not in dramatics, but in the quiet truth. Resilience, dignity, and perseverance are stronger than arrogance, cruelty, and temporary triumphs. She had laughed at me once, and the world had shared in that laughter. But she could not avoid the consequences of her actions now. Life itself ensured that balance was restored, quietly, inexorably, completely. There were moments when I sensed her struggle, glimpses of regret and vulnerability that betrayed the inner reckoning taking place. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, that her charm and confidence insulated her from accountability. But as she navigated this new reality, she realized the fragility of her assumptions. The man she had humiliated had endured, had grown, and had returned stronger, not out of spite, but through the quiet accumulation of self-respect, strength, and composure. And she, who had once believed herself in control, had no choice but to acknowledge the shift. The ceremony itself, though simple, carried immense symbolic weight. She approached it with apprehension, aware that she was no longer the master of her own narrative. I was calm, collected, and composed, embodying the transformation that years of struggle had forged. The crowd may have seen only a formal event, but for us, it was the culmination of a long, silent reckoning. She was facing the reality that power is never permanent when it is built on the humiliation of others, and that the man she had once discarded had risen far beyond the reach of her arrogance. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that what she had inflicted could not be undone, that the laughter she had shared was replaced now by reflection, by understanding, by accountability. And in that, there was a quiet satisfaction, not for myself, but for the integrity of truth. Life had delivered justice not through spectacle, but through inevitability, through the slow, precise return of balance. And she, finally, was learning the cost of cruelty, the weight of pride, and the importance of dignity. In those moments, I understood a profound truth. Humiliation, no matter how public, cannot destroy a person who chooses to endure and rebuild. I had faced the worst, survived it, and grown stronger. She, on the other hand, was now confronting what it meant to have power withheld, to have choices constrained, to face consequences that could not be laughed away. Life had taught the lesson that no confrontation, no argument, and no dramatics could ever replicate. Resilience outlasts cruelty, patience outlasts arrogance, and dignity outlasts humiliation. The marriage itself was less about union and more about transformation. For her, it was a journey through humility, awareness, and accountability. For me, it was a quiet affirmation that I had moved beyond the reach of public shame, that the man she had humiliated had reclaimed his life, his strength, and his dignity. There was no need for vengeance, no need for dramatic gestures. The universe, through its own inexorable logic, had restored balance, teaching lessons that words alone could never convey. As she navigated this new reality, I watched and felt a sense of closure that was long overdue. I was no longer the victim of her cruelty, no longer defined by the humiliation she had inflicted. I had endured, grown, and transformed. And in doing so, I became the quiet force that demonstrated the inevitability of consequences. And she, finally, was learning what it meant to face the outcomes of her actions, guided not by anger or vengeance, but by the natural consequences of her choices. The world that had once cheered her laughter now observed a different reality, a woman confronted by the consequences of her actions, and a man who had risen above humiliation to embody strength, composure, and dignity. There was no public spectacle, no dramatic confrontation, just life itself, delivering justice quietly, inevitably, and with profound clarity. And in that clarity, I found peace. I realized then that revenge is never necessary when life itself enforces balance. The humiliation she had once inflicted had transformed, returning not as suffering, but as awareness, accountability, and growth. The man she had thrown away became the measure against which she would learn the lessons she had long ignored. And in witnessing her reckoning, I finally understood the ultimate power of endurance, the quiet strength of dignity, and the irrepressible truth that those who rise above cruelty emerge not only victorious, but free. Life had delivered closure without spectacle, without drama, without the need for vengeance. The man she had humiliated had reclaimed his narrative, his strength, and his dignity. And she, facing the consequences of her actions, had no choice but to acknowledge the lesson she had long refused to learn. Choices matter, pride has limits, and the echoes of cruelty are never far from those who wield it. In that balance, in that quiet reckoning, the story was complete, and I finally knew peace.